Hello everyone, today we talk about the Teutonic Order and the Knights of St. John for our early modern warfare series. There are actually many more Renaissance-era monastic military orders, many which also survive to this day, just like the Teutonic Knights and the Hospitallers / again, Knights of St. John, Knights of Malta, Knights of Rhodes, depending on the different eras and denominations, but they're the same thing. On Schwerpunkt, we often refer to the importance in the continuity of Crusader, not just ideals, but also and especially practice throughout the modern age. This relentless spirit of devotion, of faith, of commitment to one's religion that spiritually stems from very deep ancestral origins that we also discuss here and there in the videos about the medieval monastic military orders, but that we will have to link up with much more sort of traditional religious content, because there's a very specific fil rouge connecting them. Videos like these are meant to just introduce, as always, generally speaking, the military, if anything, of early modern polities. Of course, these ones are very peculiar because they are at times veritable states, but also having different stories, different power, different life as meaningful entities. Today we will just give a look at these two, and we will perhaps start also some kind of Renaissance era, also later history era regional series, so that we can explain better what was going on in Europe in that enormity that also the modern age actually was, in terms of, again, continuity, not just with tradition, but with feudalism. Just the other day made that video about kings and generals, sort of, alleged debunking, sort of alleged misconceptions that really make you wonder sometimes whether they're not really made up for the sake of making a video, but that, in fact, explain a bit the wall. Like, that Schwerpunkt has this specific focus of bringing all together, but not in a, hopefully not, at least, in a chaotic fashion, but rather showing the complexity of eras that we don't, in fact, remember for any particular political unity, just like, the great Catholic empires of the ancient world, the Macedons, the Romans, and that yet were essentially a continuation of that. We explained also how, indeed, the same Holy Roman Imperial notion is very much, in this sense, for example, very much tied, of course, to Teutonic Knights, also in a strictly German sense, quite evidently, but also as far as the others that had originated in the, had stuck mostly, at least to the, because also the Teutonic Knights in the Outremer states, and the Eastern Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean, in this case with Malta, are really part of a whole, of a unitary vision of the world that these fighters and hell fighters were keeping alive, also in times of perceived and or objective decline like this. And you see how everything intertwines. The other day I made that video about the First Moran War. We've seen the Knights of Malta work together with the Tuscans, with the Venetians, with the Papals, and even German, Saxon, Protestant forces on that occasion. So that ideal, the different theaters that we cover, say, showing how much continuity with that broader universal dimension rather than a strictly sort of modernistically and secularistically, nationalistically intended one, is very much at the root of also the same national identities, of the same international relations, of the same unitary purposes, in fact, of multiple powers with different characteristics, but coming together as a part of a whole that is organically, hierarchically ordered and properly deserved in a divine perspective. Now, we start with the Teutonic Knights. Again, I just chose these two major orders because they're the most famous in general, but there are many, we will see now, from from the Reconquista, we'll briefly talk something, because here we also start a bit from the last decades of the 15th century. Naturally, the Hospitallers, the Order of St. John, is something sort of big as well, and very much long-lasting in its sort of famously as internationally military traditions during the modern era. In the video about the First Moran War, we talked about the Order of St. Stephen and how they were even competing with the same Knights of Malta, because this is yet another a bit overlooked topic, how competitive the military orders actually were with them, right? You have a glimpse of that during, or even more than a glimpse of that, during the Outremer states crusading era, but it continues on, and there are all different inclinations, peculiarities, etc. I made a couple of videos about the Templars, the Hospitallers. We really have to make more about the Teutonic Knights, but we also introduced their state, their Ordensstaat, in fact, in this political regional perspective, in a world video for the medieval history. So the Teutonic Knights thus had emerged, like many others, originally from a bit the mists of history of that 11th century, as yet another order of warrior monks. Right, there were many, or what we ignore often about traditional societies, that everything was part of an order in general. Guilds, corporations, estates, but they were all represented in an orderly, as we've seen, and hierarchically and corporately, or in fact, ordained and declined fashion. Right, so many hospitals, many assistants and escort. Orders had been born very also non-military ways in the beginning. That there was a compartment must eventually develop to take over, mostly from a military point of view, of course in a militarized context. And that's why they are all fascinating, because they all were born under a specific protector, a patron saint. The Teutonic Knights, famously enough, having the Virgin Mary as such. And skipping, of course, like the medieval part that we all better know, but they were still a functioning military force well into the 16th century. You know that in the 15th there is the sort of the biggest blow in, at least that brought to the decline, to the descending parabola of the Ordensstaat, especially in the defeat suffered at Grunwald, Tannenberg, against the Poles, the Lithuanians, and everyone essentially wanted to see the order shrink in power, because it had really become very threatening, especially to this emerging monarchies that originally had even called the knights for help, and that had remained somehow choked by their overwhelmingly effective and efficient expansion. Right, we should point out that the Teutonic Knights, as properly a monastic state, was naturally much more highly efficient than a lay one. Right, things really work in different fashion. We'll have to enter a bit the depths of that, but it's consistently the single most centralized system existing in the broader, essentially German world, because it is really a German state, regardless of the participation of many other knights, even just as guests, to participate into the crusade, mostly for central northern Europeans. The Baltic was the preferential option to the Outremer states. Not that they hadn't frequented those. In fact, the Teutonic Knight born in Palestine was exactly the proof of this, among others. Of course. However, at this point, the territorialization that we were just discussing yesterday of the late medieval period after the Great Crisis brings also to a necessary showdown, right? There aren't say heathens anymore to put down in northeastern Europe, unless we consider the Ruthenians as part of those who had not just like instead, for example, the Ruthenian Palatinate had done, actually united with Rome. You know that there is a Greek Catholic Church, which is essentially the Ukrainian one that historically from the 13th century had sided with the papacy, had united with the West, and then a much less developed Orthodox, so-called Greek Orthodox world that survived, especially at this point, with great difficulties after the fall of Constantinople. And aside from that, there's a point we must recognize is that at that point, being a pre-Christian, Lithuanian, or a Muslim, it was not that far away from being, a Greek Orthodox, right? Especially considering the state of Eastern Europe at the time, it's obvious that the peoples like the Teutonic Knights would see those populations as just a bunch of savages to be conquered at best, right? And the general presence of not just the Germans but the Scandinavians were in the Baltic, especially the most advanced element, right? The Baltic peoples were very underdeveloped, and again, Lithuania had managed in coalescing to some kind of broader duchy, like a principality that had also taken over a great part of southern Ruthenia, but that without the alliance with Poland was a traditional enemy of theirs, and still on top of namely the largest territorially extended polity in Europe during the 14th century was being steamrolled by the Teutonic Knights. All right, as territorial size does not translate itself into power. In case, especially the Middle Ages, haven't told you enough at some point. Now, today, as I was saying, we make things really simple, and so we look mostly at their military organization. In the early stages of this era, the Teutonic Knights supplied some of the only troops deemed regular to some extent in what was still essentially a feudal forest, right? As if we consider the broader and heavily at this point Germanized in the sense not Germanicized, but just properly nationally Germanized Holy Roman Empire, in fact, of the German nation, that although comprising, in fact, Italians, Slavs, French, etc., was mostly trying to make sense of itself with a monarchy that was basically just self-standing, legitimizing itself north of the Alps more than else. I made lots of videos about the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgic relations with the Teutonic Order are quite interesting. Besides, when we talk about these orders, the great part of the charm deriving from these cavaliers was indeed connected with the fact that the system was very international, right? Teutonic Knights houses, just like the Templar ones, the Hospitalier ones, had been scattered all over Europe, right? Of course, the Teutonic Knights were more concentrated in Germany, but they were present everywhere. And as a consequence, also, people from many different countries would side with them, would temporarily be, let's say, stiffening their ranks. And many different international figures at different times would become masters of the order. Yes, in this case, especially with a specific national background, but not quite in the sense that this enormous, as fragmented Germany was to be considered like a univocal country in all its complexity and its other different alignments, considering that this is also the moment of the Protestant Reformation. So for the Catholic monastic state, this means a lot, right? To be surrounded mostly by, especially northern Germany in Scandinavia, by Protestant powers. But their time had sort of passed already, and as you know, in fact, the Teutonic Order would in part be territorially substituted or at least integrated by what was the possession of the House of Brandenburg, the Hohenzollerns. And so Teutonic Prussia proper would become a chunk of that the territory that, again, even when large, was very, very primitive in many ways. I mean, the Teutonic orders had done miracles in keeping together their state, but you couldn't help the fact that it was a Baltic power in the Renaissance. So definitely not providing. In fact, in hindsight, with this overwhelming potential at that point, in fact, it was gradually falling apart. Nevertheless, the elite nature, which is also in fact what contrasts in general with this decline of these orders that was there since the beginning as a raison d'etre, is amplified in the Teutonic case by the fact that they were still a big feudal system of some sort, where they could levy an important amount of forces and disciplining them and or leading them in particular from some higher level of, in fact, monastic military mentality, not specifically the needs of a secular modern system. All right, they often surpass, therefore, in efficiency organizationally most feudal levies prevalent at the time, especially in this part of central, northern, eastern, because everything overlaps there geographically and culturally, Europe. A prominent surviving faction was the bulk and probably the statal reference in charge over also these different elements was the order itself, right? The Teutonic Knights incarnated the higher level of rank, right, of moral, spiritual quality, military efficiency, that, as you know, had themselves as a form of fighters underwent significant decline in the Renaissance. That starts being the age of pike and shot warfare. Nevertheless, again, we said it a lot of times, the more north and east in Europe you go, the least sort of updated in pike and shot terms, especially you are, right? And you tend to rely mostly on feudal retinues. We've seen this, for example, in the video about the German peasant uprising. We've seen how even the Lorrainese forces that were fairly westernized were still going at the beginning of the 16th century with essentially like a knightly army of feudal retinues. The Teutonic Knights, the Ordenstaat, held significant sway in northeastern Germany and effectively controlled this domains in the Baltic territories of Latvia, Livonia, and Estonia. This autonomy, rooted in their essentially theocratic governance, allowed them to maintain a sophisticated administrative system, quite centralized, not really parceled out like a dynastic one, including advanced taxation and land management, which underpinned their military capabilities. It had really taken a lot of energies to transform the rugged Baltic lands into something sort of more approximable to a civilized world. And this had largely been the merit of the German colonization, and also under the protection of the Teutonic Knights' swords, right, to parry the local colonist settlers from the bloody attacks of the Baltic peoples, right? Of course, the Teutonic Knights were not exactly people provided with much sense of human mercy for that matter. But, you know, if you were captured by an angry Lithuanian sort of pre-Christian boyar of some sort, like, you could simply be cooked alive inside your own knightly armor, right? These are the nice folkloristic traditions of these incredibly tender and cute lands. Now, in Prussia, the order disintegrated in 1525, notoriously when the Grand Master Albrecht von Hohenzollern embraced Lutheranism himself, transforming the region into a secular duchy under Polish suzerainty. Because technically, again, Teutonic Prussia in particular had been born as a vassal of the Piasts back in the day, in the 13th century, marking a significant shift in the order's political and religious identity. Right. Farther east, however, the order persisted until 1562, when its defeated remnants were dissolved after the Ruthenian invasion of Livonia, culminating in the secularization of the latter under Polish-Lithuanian influence, effectively ending the order's independent military presence in the region as a proper polity. If anything, again, the order remained in the sense that there were various members across Europe, but it had lost its political independence and territorial control. Far from being an insignificant military presence, these medieval stormtroopers still, at the break of the Renaissance, wielded considerable power. During the 16th century, they were capable of inflicting heavy casualties to some aggressive neighboring opponents. Their tactical quality at this point consisted mostly of a blend of a traditional chivalric warfare. So in the wake of that knightly mounted shock combat, but also the emerging gunpowder technology. Right, the Germans, as we explained, were the more technologically advanced people in the region, and so at least compared to the Eastern Europeans, that also had, as we've seen, also for example, in the case of Lithuanian warfare, a consistent amount of firepower, and also provided at some point with some logistical advantages. For example, they controlled the rivers from the mountains, and so the Teutonic Knights, if anything, controlled the ports, which was more economically convenient. But militarily speaking, like those Lithuanians, for example, were used to launch pretty bloody raids, again, down the rivers themselves, and carrying, for example, their own artillery with them. So you can argue that the Teutonic Knights, at least from this is really typical of the monastic military orders, did not really, on the surface and materially speaking, differ very much or at all, telling the truth, from any other military power at the time. They weren't like, in video games, special units or, some kind of different tactical bias or flavor to it. They were exactly the same you would find in Germany, except their spiritual training was excellent. And these people were driven by a sense of duty, commitment, and devotion. And as we were saying at the beginning, was properly derived from the notion that the monastic military order was normally to provide elite knights that had to take down, 30 men before dying in combat. And so living up to these standards, also because, as we explained in the relative videos, most of these people didn't have really nothing to lose in the traditional sense of, maybe a knight had some secular lifestyle and private possessions. It's not like they didn't control something, but they had that within an order that in that sense was not understood as dynastic. They had properly entered the order by rejecting the world in a deeper metaphysical sense. Now we can't perhaps digress too much on the reasons and how that had happened, but I made multiple videos on the Indo-European Holy War from Arjuna to the Templars. We talked about Bernard of Clairvaux, taming the female demon of victory. Made lots of videos explaining what this thing was really about. Perhaps this autumn we'll really get into the concept of the soul of chivalry and what properly like orders like the Templars were conceiving within the imperial Catholic tradition to be still enactable through, in fact, self-sacrifice in holy combat. There are, again, many instances of Teutonic success still in this later era. For example, led by Grand Master Walter von Plettenberg, one of the order's most distinguished leaders, they play a dynamic and effective role in the War of 1499-1503. This war witnessed the Grand Duke of Muscovy, of the Muscovy supported by the Khan of the Crimean Tatars. Just, kind of some modern alignments seem fitting. With the Grand Duke of Lithuania, the Tatar Khan of the Volga, and the order, the Teutonic Order itself. This is very fascinating because, as you understand, like the Teutonic Knights essentially live in Germany as Germans in a culture that is German, that brings Germany and that's a Middle European culture wherever they settle, right? But at the same time, they're open to more than Eastern Europe. They're open to the steppes. They're open to a world that was as understood as Tataria in many ways, that was this immense land naturally quite wild, savage one, yet to tame one. And that, however, these men had the capacities of at least conceiving and dealing with, sometimes very brutally and sort of cutting the blip short, but let's say being quite good at their work. And there's a lot of territorial ambition, religious rivalry, as you can understand. Here the Teutonic Knights are allied with their previous, historical Lithuanian enemies. The Knights' prowess stemmed from their adept use of the traditional cavalry charges that they were still good at, combined with artillery barrages, a combination that would somehow last for a bit longer in this Eastern world, as opposed to, again, the Western armies of the era that already were toying with pike and shot warfare towards a fully fledged system. It's not like the Teutonic Knights did not have infantry, of course, nor these other peoples, right? But the social and military balance was very different from there, right? Historically, these areas, aside from the German burghers, settlers here, they had not had much of a, for example, infantry militia, like some cohesive, collective development of sort, and those were also just unprofessional. There were, of course, within the feudal levies and knightly retinues, infantry, troops. Everything follows more or less, again, the same organic patterns of the rest of Western Europe. There are the lances with the attendants, etc. There's an important degree of combined armed tactics as well. But most of the Germans excel in that sort of feudal and artillery direction, at least, and especially in the Teutonic case, right? We made a video about the Habsburgic artillery of the year. It was basically the strongest, and as you noticed there, it's not like Germany was an overwhelmingly advanced system altogether. We're actually the most technologically advanced country at that time, together with Italy, which in the Renaissance speaks volumes of the world. But let's say, especially northeastern Germany was in the capacity to simply apply those technologies is something else, right? Germany is a much more sort of fairy tale, feudal, sleeping, how to compare to, I don't know, France or Spain or etc. In any case, employing such strategies, Plettenberg achieved triumphs like the Battle of the Seritza River. I will have to discuss this because while we don't know too much about what happened, because really also documentarily speaking, we know up to a certain point how to reconstruct a battle in northeastern Europe during the 16th century. We know that a Teutonic Order force of 8,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry overcame an allegedly 40,000 strong Muscovite army, a victory attributed to the Order's superior coordination and exploitation of terrain as detailed in the contemporary Livonian chronicles. This is really interesting because the Muscovite army, and I haven't been talking about Russian history much in the last few years for many reasons, but we could absolutely make a video about this because it's really fascinating to see how, of course, very, very Eastern and even Asian Muscovite forces actually looked like at this point. All right, they could be barely distinguished from their Mongol counterparts in many ways. If anything, they had some sort of more European backbone, but all those tens of thousands that we collected here do fit with the concept. There's a lot of lighter cavalry in ways that really are very similar to the ones of the Turco-Mongol steppes, and that, for example, were not present in the same fashion. In general, when these lighter forces met with sort of even smaller but more courageous contingents, like in this case, they fail. At least there is all precedent due to the quite highly effective Mongol tradition. In the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights, at least people say that at Lenitsa there weren't actually Teutonic Knights, nor that they ended up thus massacred. Doesn't matter very much, like there is a Slavo-Germanic element there that is expression also of that kind of same military culture from which the Teutonic Knights emerged, and again, which many of those aristocrats normally went to the Baltic to participate to the Crusades against the heathen were made of. But as we explained in other videos, it's not like the Mongols simply attacked the Western forces head on. They were aware that they would have been crushed in a direct confrontation, in a smashing. So they had to recur to feint retreats, to outflanking maneuvers that are complicated and difficult. And just they can't do that because they're a veteran army. They're pretty good at it. But overall, the Mongols are very good because they understand how good also the Westerners really are. So it's not really, again, an easy win or something you have to simply give for granted. Also because in later times, same Mongol forces at some point require Western troops armaments. This is very well documented, especially in the Ilkhanate of Persia. But we could talk more about the Golden Horde in that regard. An earlier Teutonic Order force with fewer infantry can shed light on their detailed makeup. 1,000 heavily armored cavalry, 600 light cavalry, 1,300 militia infantry, and 400 mercenary infantry. A composition that highlights the Order's reliance of a core of elite knights supplemented by local and hired troops that are fairly scarce, like in fact in the other elements other than in fact the heavy cavalry. This naturally by the 16th century could be understood in different ways because also more detailed breakdowns would be available, but let's say that in general, right, say by Western European standards, can say at this time, because again at this time things had already changed. This is also slightly earlier, but say by the mid 15th century, cavalry normally was accompanied by much larger amounts of infantry. What is fascinating in this sense is almost a champion culture that the declining Teutonic Knights still show to have by simply going out there as sheer knights without much cover from sort of some solid infantry forces. I mean, 1,000 heavily armored cavalry, just 400 mercenary infantry, presumably the latter heavier than the 1,300 militia, is really not that much, right? It's just normally a 1 to 4 to 5 is already a pretty cavalry-heavy army by Western standards. This tells you really a lot. Naturally, these heavily armored cavalrymen would have at some point also dismounted. Warfare is waged in different ways. There's a lot of siege craft, a lot of, especially in the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance, a lot of field fortifications that spread further, especially together with artillery use, etc. So the Teutonic Knights would have been apt at that business themselves, but seemingly being very much confined at that point to their mere sort of individual commitment in a world around was sort of falling apart, and therefore not providing them with this enormous auxiliary force that at least they had in plentier proportion in the past, right? Perhaps even cheap ways. If you look at late medieval, I made a video about Baltic tactics during the later Middle Ages. We've seen how, the Teutonic Knights had never really favored too much infantry, but in places like Estonia, for example, where the local society was so poor and primitive that social certification was next to non-existent, it was easier to just, whoever you would hire, you would levy was an infantryman, right? And so it turns out that, for example, the Teutonic Knights on that instance make use of infantry wings on their sides, which was a pretty straightforward tactic all over Western Europe and beyond, likely. Also at Legnica, again, the Germans and the Poles used the same one, except in heavily feudal realities, you don't hear very much of that. If anything, Estonia would have just obliged you to, if you were a Teutonic Knight, to arrive and say, okay, what do you use as auxiliaries? There's just infantry, just peasants. So these are, you may think it's a cliche, it's not a cliche. Like in Northeastern Europe, what may sound like a cliche becomes the fully nightmarish reality of those places. And these are very tough places, very tough lands, very tough peoples, because again, in open field they're basically nothing, but in terms of guerrilla warfare, they're very annoying. And yet again, the Teutonic Knights had, in fact, basically disintegrated a great part of their resistance capability. The Lithuanians, again, had to really Christianize themselves and ally themselves with the Poles to even hope to make it alive in the at least as an independent people in the pages of history. As it was really typical of any monastic military order's army organization, the order's brethren made up only a small fraction of its total forces. So we've seen from one side, yes, that they rely a lot on knights. That can mean also different things, like here we actually talk about heavy cavalry. So again, what was traditionally the milas, right? In medieval times, the knight in this sense was the actual brethren, right? But aside from auxiliary knights, I mean allied knights, etc. In fact, we can see how in this peripheral European reality, the reliance on the elite force was almost a necessity, right? It was forced by the lack of other resources. Historically, it had been like that, but by now things had become more difficult. The order's brethren elite status, of course, was underscored, as we were saying before, by their rigorous spiritual and martial training that really set them apart as a military aristocracy. As I said before, there were different orders in Europe that you could simply participate in while being, a king, the emperor, or any nobleman, right, involved in different business at a time, as there was still this mentality of the errant knight. If you look at, in fact, the order's masters and the components, etc., there was this idea that you would go over to Prussia and actually settle there if you were, depending on whether you entered the order in that case, yes. But you had otherwise a different origin, right? You could come from different places, Thuringia, Swabia, etc. So at large, a German background, but one that chose this sort of secluded part of the world to, in fact, train their resistance, their resilience, their pressure. It was very tough to live in that environment under any political, military, and social circumstance, even and especially, I would say, as an elite knight. We explained essentially what these were about, also from a psychological point of view, in training, combat, in many of our videos from the medieval knighthood series. Typically, given their preeminence, the order's brethren, and thanks to their experience, their harsh training, often acted as officers and non-commissioned officers, leading mercenaries and levies. So informing essentially these other troops from a commanding standpoint as subordinates, so that they would benefit from their insight, from their authority, from their coup d'oeil, their charisma, and more. It was a great honor, naturally, to serve together with Teutonic Knights. Remember that a consistent part of the Ordenstaats's forces were, especially in these lower ranks, local feudal levies and auxiliaries. So this was really like any other place in Europe. There was a feudal nobility that was involved through different contracts by the Teutonic Order in the Ordenstaats's land, and then there were local militias that provided with the auxiliaries. So everything worked more or less in a regular fashion. It's just at the top that the brethren were really something else. As we pointed out before, but is just an example of a breakdown of a Teutonic force, given the general availabilities of the Baltic, the Order brethren would, however, still account for a larger portion of the heavy cavalry altogether, right? And they were equipped, especially at this point, imagine, Maximilian armor, full plate armor starting to become not much obsolete, but hyper expensive, a punching shock force, which may also frankly suggests that most of the Teutonic enemies were lighter cavalrymen, which in Eastern Europe is very much the case, right? And again, Teutonic knights fight also on other battlefields, so it's not like their military experience is confined just to the Baltic and adjacent regions. However, it does make sense, like if you have to just rely on like if you have to charge to get the enemy or die basically in the process, and you're short of other resources, there's a bit this heroic, sometimes really bold and almost suicidal, but still effective strategy of charging straight in the melee and starting chopping people to pieces, which is essentially the only reason why these orders existed in the first place. This still required, of course, an important support by auxiliaries, lighter forces especially. As we've seen also in the medieval history video, all professed brethren were required to grow a beard and were identifiable by a black enameled silver Ritterkreuz worn around their necks and a black cross with silver edging displayed on their tunics. Symbols that reinforce their corporate identity, religious mission, other than being useful recognition tools in combat. There was, of course, a great psychological effect to this de facto level of uniformity that was otherwise unknown to other kind of troops still at this point. This was typical of the monastic military order that, in fact, knew how important that cohesive, unitary mentality and identity served in combat, right, for fighting purposes in a deeply spiritual and traditional fashion. Of course, there was a lot in the relative video about the medieval symbolism of this stuff. We discussed why they had come to adopt this badges. Naturally, it was something very martially dark, indeed, about the colors of the Teutonic Order, the contrast between white and black, and all the various saints references, also in the various branches of the order, had been absorbed in previous times, what they had derived from. You can find this in the videos about dress, uniform, all this stuff. There's a playlist entirely dedicated to it. The Ritterkreuz in particular served as a badge of honor. Its design rooted in the order's crusading heritage and its black enamel signifying penitence or martial devotion. Other soldiers serving under the order might have worn its surcoat, which was white with a narrow black cross, a garment that usually unified diverse troops under the order's banner. Practice changed, so as far as, I don't know, how you could wear the beard type of, probably the type of the uniform, of the dress, how it had to be made, what kind of customization. For example, heraldic devices from the families of origins could be brought. Normally, the Teutonics were among the most stringently sort of stern and sort of undecorated in this regard. Other orders had some greater liberty in this regard. Remember that all these men came from an aristocratic background, and so while the choice to be part of the order was the aforementioned rejection of the word in all its deterior manifestations, still there was a lifestyle, a mentality, a practice that still, because of the nobility of the members, was considered to be acceptable. Leaders, including the Grand Master, that, as we've seen, was usually this more international presence, and or at least was mostly the guy who would get mostly characterized also through the coat of arms, so distinguishing a master from the other by the name, so recognized beyond the uniformity, were in fact marked by more ornate equipment in general. Also, there is all a mentality that varies from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance somewhat regarding these. If anything, just because of how fashion was changing in some cases, but also, in fact, in how it would apply to also changing order at this point. At the Battle of Tannenberg, in 1410, Grand Master donned gilt armor and a white cloak. a display of wealth and authority. It also made him a target, by the way, but that was still an age which, obviously, being seen in sort of in the most possible, most straightforward way, was still pretty effective, especially for a commander to inspire his men and proving against which kind, in fact, of enemy you were to fight. This would continue essentially until the 19th century even. But again, in a knightly culture, in a feudal world, in these more champion-based or also more individual warrior kind of mentalities, there was such a sense of beneficence and in individual splendor. This, to some degree, paradoxically contributed in that specific battle to the order's catastrophic defeat by Polish-Lithuanian forces, if anything, for what was perceived as an excess, and so also morally punished in this fashion. Now, the order employed trumpets and drums. The Marian hymns were apparently played at some point with some portable organs on the battlefield itself. So also in there was a particular vision of the world. If you look at how music worked in Christian theology from the Pythagorean Pseudo-Europacid Dionysian sort of mentality and numerical symbolism. The Teutonic Knights' standard battle cry field word was "Being Gott mit uns," famously enough, "God with us," a phrase that rallied troops and reflected, of course, the order's self-perception as divinely ordained warriors. The order's last war was against the Ruthenian invasion of Livonia in 1557-62. This was a desperate struggle that exposed, at that point, their diminished capacity in the face of the Muscovite expansion under Ivan IV, and by this point it could only field 2,000 cavalry and a limited number of infantry. They were basically a provincial force at most, a stark contrast to their earlier strength, and of course reflecting the order's current decline, loss of territorial control. Yet, by this point, just for the sake of military technicality, the infantry were equipped with arquebuses and pikes, so they had, of course, acquired that since the beginning. Before it was highlighting, of course, more feudal this word would remain, but it's not like pike and shot tactics were not used since their inception. Just you needed larger amounts of troops, and like in this case, having major pike squares, more complex arrays was not quite possible, because you need really lots of pikemen to do that, a lot of really subtle resources to train them, to supply them. Importantly enough, it's possible that some Landsknechten participated to this last Teutonic enterprises and made a video about the Landsknechts and, what their historical deal was, right? We intend them as some sort of almost proletarian soldiery, simply subordinated to the emperor in a sense, but they were something very different at the time, almost libertine in their tastes and in their almost errant, in fact, autonomy as far as especially selling their services. So any German lord that would pay for their service outside of the imperial wars that cyclically commanded their presence on our battlefield. So it's a very interesting scenario, because you hardly hear this time in this place, and even the Landsknecht, and how, just imagine how what the broader worldview would have come to this point, almost an apocalyptic one. As early as 1454, the Teutonic Order had started transitioning from crossbow-armed infantry to handgunners. It's not that early, right? But for northeastern Europe, it was a little bit, right? In Italy, in the last decades of the 14th century, we already had like 1/3 of the infantry made up by handgunners. Even the most advanced German craftsmanship could not supply a Baltic power, considering the local resources over there, just to have a substantial amount of firepower. Naturally, 1454 is just a typical date where we first hear of those kind of guns. Those would have existed immediately before, but not in particularly large quantity. One of the banners we have from the actual times belonging to the Master of the Order featured the Virgin Mary in glory. Of course, the potent symbol of the Order's Marian devotion that resonated with their crusading ethos. Banners captured by the Poles from the Order at Tannenberg are recorded, and comparable ones were likely used into the 16th century. The one we described before was captured by the Lithuanians at Tannenberg. And so when you look at these works of art, telling the truth, you realize that their iconography served both as a rallying point. We'll make a video at some point on probably the statutes of the Templars that describe in some depth the most advanced sort of cavalry tactics of the era, and how prominent, of course, the banner really was for crucial tactical purposes of orientation, right, and spiritual boosting, in fact, as also a declaration of the Order's religious identity and purpose itself. Then, again, as you understand, very simple review. At some point, we will get very much more in depth with another video. And before passing to the Knights of Malta, there are different theaters at this point. You find military orders involved in the Americas, for example, like you have a general spread of Christendom across the globe, and noblemen that were just there for other purposes, but were part of these the orders at some point, were involved in all kinds of clashes. Given that we look at the later medieval phase, at least the end of the 15th century, we could make some brief mention of the Reconquista, but it would be perhaps too much of a digression. There is the Order of San Diego. I made a video in which I explained the badges, if anything, on the major Iberian military orders. The aforementioned Order of San Diego had a notable impact during the clashes with the Moors in the late 15th century against Granada, etc. In any case, there are so many different, also smaller ones, or even larger ones that would deserve a video on their own. So we simply go straight to the Hospitallers that have a major record, tradition, military curriculum in general. The Hospitallers, also known as the Knights of St. John, whose land forces were primarily stationed on Rhodes until its fall to the Ottomans in 1522, and subsequently on Malta, where they withstood a renowned siege in 1565, an epic one, continued their efforts under the conclusion of the Turkish maritime wars in 1575. This reflects the Turkish wars at sea, right? The Mediterranean becoming, after centuries of essentially Christian dominance, a newly contended theater. The Hospitallers had to move from mainland Ottoman states to different locations. They had been close to different episodes, including, for example, the Timurid invasion of Anatolia. At that point, together with the Venetians, the Order of St. George had basically outlawed, which in hindsight was not this terrific choice, but at the time they couldn't predict how it would have ended, to the revival of the Ottomans after their dreadful defeat at Ankara. So they basically backed the reestablishment of a more cohesive Ottoman power that had basically become engulfed after that blow into a dynastic civil strife. They resisted, again, to the Ottomans' different strongholds that they controlled. There's a very close story here with the Venetians. All these powers are acting in an independent way, right? This is very important to stress. There are some orders. We've seen it in the video about Vlad Tepes, for example, the Order of the Dragon, all that stuff. It sounds pretty cool. And there are many right? Famous, the most important ones, naturally, the Order of the Garter, the Order of the Golden Fleece. There are really many. Some are more distinctly tied to particular houses, right? The latter to, obviously, to England, Burgundy, eventually to the Habsburgs, and the different branches that split from the dissolution of the Burgundian states, just their partition. You have, as we've seen, also maritime military orders and monastic military orders. In this sense, the orders of St. John are forced to become one because of their Mediterranean odyssey, peripacies, etc. They were well installed, etc. But, for example, the aforementioned Order of St. Stephen that had been created as almost like a competitive order with the Hospitaliers one by the Medici of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany were quite active and quite picked troops, as we've seen again in the video about the First Morean War, where they surpassed at that point, at the end of the 17th century, in quality, even the military quality, probably the Knights of St. John. All right. You understand, again, what really shocks you in this is the incredible devotion and commitment that random aristocrats had to these orders, just as a matter of sheer prestige. As we explained in different videos talking about these changes, gradual changes in the matters of honor, of belief, what does it mean to be a monastic military, a military monk, say better, in a knight in that sense, in the age of confessional struggle, Protestantism, of the Counter-Reformation, of the Jesuits. Like, it's something deeper. It's a broader international stand in this sense. And in part, the reason why we don't talk enough about these powers is because at least the world in which we are raised tends to reject anything that is not modern and secular to some degree, and to essentially indicate everything religious and traditional as evil or bad or whatever, without even understanding what these guys were really doing, because we're really shielding the southern frontier of Christianity from a pretty perilous Muslim threat, right? That's why such topics are so fascinating, among the other things. Naturally, in their struggle against the Ottomans, the Knights of Malta had really distinguished themselves for their elite nature. They didn't leave less to the expectation of their medieval tradition, martial order. It's also somehow apocalyptically romantic, even for these, as we've seen the Teutonic Knights faded in that same fashion, but at least those orders that had stuck to the Holy Land had suffered this dramatic blow of witnessing also much of their former prestige and actual power depleted. That's how the Templars, for example, had been taken out in perspective. That's how, in part, also the military traditions of those times had been lost. What, if anything, was saving these orders was the traditional commitment in itself, and so the free voluntary will of these aristocrats. They were naturally more affluent than the average, were privileged compared to the average person at the time, but they were not so incredibly rich. Like, it's not that they were making so much money in surplus on a regular basis. It's also investing their property in arms, armor, in maintaining themselves, etc., like for these military purposes that at some point were yielding very few, also in material terms, and still doing so for the sake of the order, not much of yourself, was, however, considered one of the greatest honors of any house, of any family. And of course, there were these these auxiliaries, this other soldier that fought, and if anything, just for a living, maybe living in Malta itself, in this case, and enduring all the hardships. Think about being this small order and facing the Ottomans, not alone, but still with a mentality that conceives traditionally the order as a universe within itself, as a sort of reflection of divine perfection. based on the order's rules, and so also the way you would, especially the Catholically speaking, especially through the works, through the deeds of the knights, like reflecting that virtue, that word. This is deeply important because if a Protestant denies works, what's also again the purpose of a monastic military order? What are the knightly works at that point at war, like word really? This is very important to reflect on. The Knights of St. John's martial activities persisted until the close of the 18th century, by the way, though by that time their strength had waned considerably. Because, in a sense, it's not much that the concept had become anachronistic, but, of course, they hadn't developed essentially as a territorial state, right? And obviously enough, even if you look at their medieval origins, I mean, just the Teutonic Knights had really constituted a real state, something that would be fitting a broader picture. If anything, because in the Baltic there were no states yet to have been built. But let's say they could have not achieved something within the same Germany, for example, even though that kind of became Germany thanks to them. But it's obvious that it doesn't matter how rich the Templars, the Hospitallers, etc., they never had the possibility to create a territorial state on their own, ipso facto. So eventually, of course, in the age of modern states and beyond, they stuck to the concept of the order that was subsidized, that they still exist today. But, of course, with a very different meaning and role of the role. And probably, if you look at the background of certain masters, it really makes you wonder if they actually know much about the imperial Catholic tradition, if they know what the original purpose. I think the current Master of the Teutonic Order, for what it's worth in that, say, at least practical, specific sense, is a guy who studied business and worked in a bank. Now, it's not like you can't be a traditionalist and understanding the deeper meaning of the vocation for that. I'm not going to express myself on that because that's not the point. The point is, what are we actually looking at this stuff for? This is a problem that encompasses a bit the whole world, not just traditional institutions, or what they should be maintained as such. So it's not much like some people think that these orders were, for example, military obsolete. No, they were actually quite updated in their own way, just they didn't have, if anything, the statal backing, like they didn't have the means to compete with other major polities per se. There were at most some picked forces that at some point again became obsolete in the face of the bigger ones in a broader collective, strategical, logistical sense, but not because they were inherently bad or there was something anachronistic about this kind of warfare. On the contrary, again, they were quite competent and they reflected during the 16th and the 17th century a real way to war, and quite a school also to learn from that. About the Hospitallers' primary focus remained their campaign against Islam, with much of their warfare conducted on the seas, where their compact yet potent fleet of galleys, we're talking the tens, right, of units, terrorized Muslim forces in the Mediterranean, as we've seen, together with other orders, together with the Italian maritime republics, together with the Spanish navies, maintaining a campaign of maritime and coastal piracy against Islamic states, which limited their aggression factor due to their inability to deploy large land forces far from their bases. All right, so there is all a military history of this that is mostly, okay, there are bigger expeditions, some of which now we will recall as we even made videos about that. And the Maltese Knights are meant to essentially stiffen these forces, to be especially in the earlier period, some sort of diamond head and elite force that you have to throw in when things got really rough. So that was all their prestige and their reputation, and they were really that good, right? remember that here everything works if you are, I don't know, especially considering the Habsburgic domains in southern Italy and the proximity to Malta, from the fact that in the south there are the Muslims, in the east there are the Muslims, etc., the Barbary pirates, the Ottomans. You're a bit like in the eye of the storm, like the central Mediterranean, especially in the first half of the 16th century, is very active, right? And naturally they participate to Lepanto, to all the great military endeavors of the era, besides becoming even the target of the Ottoman expansionistic attempts. Had Malta fallen, of course, like Christendom would have had a great trouble to maintain some order in the central Mediterranean. Would have required at least a reconquest campaign of sort. Things would have, if anything, been diverted from other theaters, and who knows how history would have really gone, but it would have been a real threat to Italy, and it would have signaled, if anything, a renewed Ottoman capacity at sea that instead was cut short in practice, at least as far as this pushes in the Western Mediterranean were concerned at Lepanto. But this would have not been a thing hadn't Malta historically resisted in such terrific ways a few years before. In fact, Lepanto is, in a sense, also the merit of the Hospitallers. But I promise I will make more videos about Renaissance naval warfare, not just the series on the Armada, because we have to understand what this theater was really like. The maritime strategy of the Maltese knights relied on swift, well-armed galleys crewed by highly trained knights and supported by enslaved rowers that were a very typical characteristic of the modern era rather than the Middle Ages or even Antiquity, because the different religions enslaved the respective prisoners of war, enabling, through this strategy, by the way, to disrupt Ottoman supply lines and coastal settlements effectively. So their position in Malta and their imminent maritime strategy, of course, specialized the Order of St. John into this incursionary capacity, this essentially piratical activity, naturally in tandem with other forces, as we've seen, but fundamentally remaining always trained, being on the forefront, having this capacity also, but feeling the pulse of sort of the political and strategical intentions of, for example, the Barbary pirates of the same Ottomans. This does not mean, however, that the knights were not trained for participating to terrestrial battles, that they did so extensively, also during amphibious operations, of course. I made a video about Charles V's imperial conquest of Tunis in 1535. This was a great Christian victory. I also made the other on the expedition of Alger. It was a bit different. In any case, there was a lot of back and forth, especially in North Africa. There is all a specific Spanish-pushed policy that eventually evaporates a little bit over time. The Knights of St. John defended the Venetian-held Candia, that is Crete, against Turkish forces from 1648 to 1668, which was a staggering siege, one of the greatest, sort of the most heroic pages in the annals of military history. This helped also paving the way, what we've witnessed to the other day in the video about the First Mauryan War. Right, we've seen the participation of the Hospitallers in the Venetian capture of the Morea, Greece, in 1687. Also aiding the emperor in reclaiming Belgrade from the Turks in 1688. Right, that is incredibly important because of the entire epopee of, say, this is the time of Prince Eugene. This is just after also the Morean War itself. You understand these theaters are in parallel, because from one side you have the Venetians pushing against Greece, the Habsburgs pushing in Central Europe, in the Balkans, back the Ottomans that are in turmoil after the defeat at Vienna that we made so many videos about. There was all a broader resurgence, the Serbian Hajduk subsidized by these powers, etc. And the Hospitaliers go over to Central Europe too, even though they're technically not Holy Roman Imperial subjects, but they had received part of their international recognition from the same Charles V in 1530, that, as we've seen, also used them a few years after against Tunis. And so it was completely normal, especially for the, again, mostly Habsburgically aligned forces to make use of the Knights of Malta themselves. And in this case, not just in the Mediterranean, but in Central Europe. All right. So again, being a knight was being just part of the order. You would behave at some point not differently from the many errant officers, aristocrats that still lead this sort of very adventurous lifestyle, typical even of the novels, the fiction about this era. This is the time of the Three Musketeers. It's the time of Prince Eugene. It's a time of so many of a world that is changing, especially on the battlefields of northwestern Europe, towards a different direction. Makes you see this as fundamentally anachronistic, and that's where things also basically end for the Maltese. But their Renaissance military curriculum was full of enormous triumphs, especially in the 16th century. Again, the legendary sieges of Rhodes in 1582 and Malta in 1564 were this magnificent strain of resilience, of commitment, of endurance, of heroic capacity. The emperor famously stated, "Nothing in the world was ever so well lost as Rhodes." All right, we're at the time of Charles V, and this tells you how also these great figures lived in the legion of the Hospitaliers, right, and of a type of warfare that again was mostly obviously romantic as heroic, because the Ottomans were seemingly unstoppable at this point. Despite the knights' courageous resistance on that occasion ultimately succumbing, they departed with full military honors and were awarded Malta as their new stronghold by Charles V. So enemies, friends alike had the highest reputation of these troops. In Malta, during the siege orchestrated by Suleiman the Magnificent with 6,000 Janissaries, roughly 23,000 additional Turkish soldiers, and the corsair Turgut, known as the Sword of Islam, commanding 1,500 men under his banner. So paralleling a bit the same Hospitaliers, given that at least this Turgut had red and white collar, but with the blue crescent. So basically imitating the Hospitaliers, but putting the crescent on that. And I made a video about the meaning of the crescent in the Renaissance and in this recovery of traditional, very old millenary symbol. I mean, the crescent has been used by literally all, also the greater powers of, Macedon, of Rome, and way before that, of course, also in the Middle East. At this point, the crescent becomes a bit more, as I explained, the symbol of Islam in the struggle, especially in the Mediterranean. The knights famously managed to drive back the Turks. The capital of Malta is still called after the Grand Master of the Order, and this victory really curbed Turkish naval ambitions in the Mediterranean, especially thanks to the follow-up that was the equally glorious Battle of Lepanto. There is, during the Siege of Malta, also a lot of activity from the same Hospitaliers that you would imagine to be just defensively acting. But in every siege, of course, there is a counteroffensive capacity. There is an attempt to disrupt basically the enemy camps, to disrupt their offensive capacities, their siege machinery, guns, emplacement, etc. So you find the Hospitallers also carrying out raiding cavalry parties from outlying garrisons, disrupting the Turkish operations during the same siege. And so actually a very dynamic and intense kind of combat that shows you how it's not just about sort of making your stand. It's about finding ways to win, to fight this out, as they succeeded in. And these Hospitaller cavalry units, often composed of local Maltese horsemen and reinforced by small contingents of knights at the head of them, a bit what we have seen, obviously, for the Teutonic knights as well, exploited the Maltese rugged terrain that they knew also pretty well, obviously enough. It's not, as you know, a pretty extended terrain, but this agility was calculated on the basis of it to harass the Ottoman encampments, thereby stretching Turkish resources thin and contributing to the defenders' resilience. Otherwise, it was a lot of defensive, static warfare, lots of bombardments, obviously, from the Ottoman side, made a tremendous strategic and logistical effort to besiege Malta. It was a huge deal. And again, we talk a lot about Vienna, but had Malta fallen, also a lot of different things, as we were hinting at before, would have gone differently. There was a lot of sniping, for example, with the primitive muskets of the time, that, however, especially from the Ottoman side, were apparently quite long-ranged in particular, and so imagine even the landscape. Like the Teutonic Knights, the forces of the Knights of St. John included only a small number of actual order members who acted as officers, not commissioned officers, and elite vanguard troops. Marines, some sort, landing forces, stormtroopers, which is, given the longer, sort of more military functional history of the Knights of St. John, copes with sort of more advanced warfare than the one that the last Teutonic, order armies really had been tested, especially in northeastern Europe. During combat, the Knights of St. John donned a scarlet supravest that was typical from earlier times as well, a tabard-style garment worn over their armor featuring a white cross with squared ends, famously enough. Notably, the knights were recognized for wearing heavier armor on board ships compared to other nations, a practice that truly was rooted in fact, quite concrete reasons, but that was also a matter of standards of higher quality, of maintaining this knightly, a bit old-fashioned look, but not impractical. Of course, they had actually their arms and armor were pretty much in line with the ones of the era. But in general, there was the sense that they had to show up in armor, that there was something about the knightly past that was still also archetypally functional in a moral sense, and that was a way to be continuously fit, tested, so that just the best would be selected in this task. And this is very important for the quality of these forces. The government's fearsome reputation was such that in one 16th century instance, a Turkish assault was thwarted simply by, allegedly, by outfitting all available civilians in these supravests, creating the illusion of a sudden influx of knights, some sort of angelic battle line, which overwhelmed the enemy in a psychological, obviously enough, even before physical fashion. Regular soldiers, by contrast, typically bore only the white cross as a field mark on their chest and back. So these were soldiers of the order, but they were not. They were paid by the order, but were not the knights. This practice naturally facilitated for them identification in the chaos of battle, while reinforcing also at this lower level the old order's symbolic unity. At Rhodes, the defending force consisted of 500 brethren, 1,000 men-at-arms, 800 Cretan mercenaries, and several thousand local militia. This is also relatively in line with the era. Consider that, of course, the more time passes, in modern warfare, let's say being a knight becomes ever less being some kind of, in fact, ironclad warrior, right? But something more in line with the tactical, practice of the era, right? Pack and shot, and eventually tending towards the linear. And so at that point, the elite element must not be considered anymore as the ultra heavily armored elite of the later Middle Ages. It's more like these are very specifically selected people, just out of nobility, of military capacity, moral force, etc., and they therefore constitute, in fact, a spiritual elite that you can employ in particular circumstances, but also can't make the magic of medieval times compared to their enemies. Because again, there's not much that muskets are around towards the later periods. And they're becoming prevalent. But there are also just some circumstances on the battlefield in which you can make the difference through some kind of higher motivation, that you have to be very careful where you go to attack. But still, as we've seen in the video about the First Morean War, moral forces, of course, are the most important ones. And as a proper will to power, for example, to storm an enemy trench, you can take lots of losses, but if that is what is needed, you will do it only if you are that motivated and capable. You're, for example, to maintain order under fire while assaulting, something that other units will not have the training, the stamina, the attributes of. The Cretan auxiliaries are also very interesting, aside from the men-at-arms that obviously are all these noblemen that want to, so to say, join the order, at least the order's ranks, without becoming brethren, which would have brought them to a different lifestyle. But the local militia is, or at least mercenaries, depending on how they were enrolled. The Cretans, were historical mercenaries from quite a time. And they had historically passed from being famed archers in antiquity to crossbowmen in the Middle Ages under especially the Italian influx. In fact, they were under Venetian governance and generally served in Venetian forces. Some of them were still using bows, even at the beginning of today's video's timeline. But there was some, of course, we're talking Cretans, we're also talking literal Italian lords at some times that had been stationed there that Venice eventually had subsumed. And in fact, given that that Venice was jealous of her forces, they prohibited these Catholics to enlist with the knights, because they would have essentially reduced their Cretan manpower, and so it would have been a deterror for them. And again, consider that these were and not only just not becoming knights, but serving as soldiers for the knights. There was, again, all that kind of competition. And Venice was by far the biggest power. I mean, as we've seen, the Order of St. John's numerical capacity was very limited, but the Knights of Malta had so much renown that there was a concrete risk even from a larger landmass to fear for people leaving to serve in that. And the reason was obviously that just out of the population, it was in pre-industrial times, just a few people will actually go serve, especially as soldiers, as real, so professional salaried troops. And so bringing away with them a lot of skill, right? Alongside heavy artillery, at the Siege of Malta, the defenders utilized light sakers and falcons mounted on wheeled carriages. So smaller guns, portable guns that could be moved quickly. For example, they could be repositioned to reinforce bridges in the moment, maiming the Ottomans to pieces. This mobile artillery were critical in countering for example, the Janissary attempts to exploit weakened fortifications. Right, the Ottomans used veritable stormtroopers tactics like mining, bombarding, and assaulting, repeated over and over again with reserves. And again, their quality was scarcer, and the Knights of Malta are also iconically standing in the breach, again, with all their typical, at that point, metal armor that is really useful and still effective at the time against lighter Janissary's forces. They were not all light, as you know, as we've described in our videos about Ottoman warfare, but at least lacked that more sort of bulkier backbone that normally Western military had in terms of heavier soldier in general, by greater per capita wealth, by greater technological advancement. The Ottomans were quite technologically advanced at this point, from the artillery to this mining, counter-mining, as we've seen, even snipers, etc. But at large, they did not have a society as thriving, as advanced at large, and sort of potentially endowed like the Western one. They were superior at some things, but at large, they also, in terms of quality, they pointed more on quantity, right? And that's why also the siege is all the more epic in many ways. And this, again, is very tough for the knights, because, again, it's not just quality that makes it. Quantity is a strategic factor in and of itself, and so the aforementioned mobile artillery pieces allowed the knights to maintain, for example, the defensive flexibility despite their limited numbers. As I've seen, they were really scarce compared to the enemy. They had a great defensive position. During the 1564 siege, the garrison included 541 brethren and servants at arms, later increasing to 700, 3,000 Maltese militia, subsequently growing to 5,000 or 6,000. Because, again, the siege dragged on. It was time to, and means to, stiffen the garrison once again. This was very important. In fact, you have 1,200 Spanish and Italian mercenaries that are very useful, and about 1,500 others, including Greek inhabitants and galley slaves employed for labor, and so more menial jobs, and in moments like, I don't know, taking away the debris or putting together like back a barricade in the breach or something like that. And this was really a desperate strife. The Ottomans were hammering the breaches as crazy. But you have this massive stand led by the knights that, as we've seen, gather also the support of so many volunteers to join their ranks just to make a point in the world at the time. And I think it's quite a meaningful one. Contemporary paintings of the siege, some of which I used in this video, depict men on foot in full plate armor, alongside swordsmen in three-quarter plate carrying large oval shields marked with a cross of the order, likely representing the serving brethren, though not all knights and brethren fought on foot, as cavalry raids from outlying garrisons played, as we've seen, that critical role as well. The mercenaries were mostly composed of pikemen and arquebusiers, so again, the final rank soldiery of the time, with morions and burgonets, corselets. These are very iconic armor types from the era, helmets, cuirasses, and tassets for pikemen. The militia would have been outfitted with helmets and leather jerkins. They were likely armed mainly with firearms, though only 1 in 6 Maltese possessed proper weapons, reflecting the resource constraints of the defenders, a scarcity that forced the knights to rely heavily on improvised defenses and local ingenuity. Even weapons like arquebuses needed some specific kept replenishment, like ammo. And again, in the second half of the 16th century, if you're under siege on an island and under that kind of harassment and oppression, like, it's really difficult to get all what you need in the moment. It really makes cold steel a much more frequent option. It would have otherwise been in a better sort of supplied situation. Nevertheless, the Maltese knights' resolute loyalty and bravery were akin to the qualities that later earned their island the George Cross, conferred in fact by George VI during the siege undertaken by Italy and Germany in the early part of World War II, that at some point we will also look at. So, again, certain places in history are really endowed with a hell of a past. While some knights may have worn full armor as they fought on foot, they more commonly wore half armor brigandine, right? Aside from the fact that full plate armor was basically had basically disappeared per se, there were more, in fact, flexible adaptations. It was also literally a matter of heat. For example, Central Mediterranean in the heat of summer is not really a too pleasant experience unless you're on a beach bathing or something, which maybe here that wasn't far, but again, cooking yourself in within the armor is not that different from being cold from that Lithuanian that would try to set you on fire. That's it. It's really intense. And think about just the adrenaline, the sweat, the blood, seeing pieces of people scattered around in these relentless waves of horrifying Turks that are coming at the gate, coming at the breach yet again, or you have just to withstand, we've described this in some depth, for example, in the video about Vienna, right? And remember that, as we said before, that context was, not the Siege of Vienna, but it's possible, actually, I should check, there may have been actually some Knight of Malta there, by accident, if anything, but later on, they would join the effort against the Ottomans in Central Europe, in the Balkans, a few years later. So we're talking literally about the same place, the same context. Naturally, the reason why less armor would be used was the aforementioned material shortage. The main weapons during the siege would have been hand-to-hand combat, halberds, half-pikes, two-handed swords. I made some video about the arms and armor of the early modern age. You can check out in my Arms and Armor playlist for the Modern Warfare 1. Based on near contemporary illustrations, many soldiers of the order carried oval bucklers painted red with a white protector, which was naturally quite evocative. This would have been the knights per se, in particular. The Grand Master Jean de Valette, despite his 70 years, evident in his white beard, mustache, and hair, took an active role wielding a two-handed sword that required a lot of physique, by the way, that especially at that age and in those times, in circumstances, is a marvel to behold. And obviously, in a breach, if you start wielding that two-handed sword, the purpose is, again, cutting Ottomans to pieces, chunk by chunk. And we made the example of the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Battle of Grunwald, here, also to, again, prove that he was fearless and guiding with this divine grace the clash that is also, remember, witnessed by the Protestants as well, that are sort of cheering for the Ottomans in a way or another. In most of their control, the part of Europe was controlled by them. So really conferring to the Counter-Reformation, to the general Catholic image in those generations, a resplendent aura. In fact, as the cloth of gold supravest in the aforementioned type of shield that he actually wore in combat. The defenders at Malta also employed specialized siege weapons such as circles of flaming weighting dropped onto groups of assailants on foot, fire grenades housed in earthenware pots with 4 spouts, and Trump's amps that were a sort of pole-mounted short-range flamethrower for flaming. This sounds very much like an exotic stuff from the Crusades, not like the medieval hospitaliers would have not witness to this stuff. We've seen, for example, how the Siege of Acre looked like, by the way. Just for telling you also how homemade in certain circumstances, but let's say more than else, more traditional military technology was at this time, in spite, again, of the modernistic technologistic idea that firearms took everything over. That's not quite the thing. Like, this clashes, especially in close quarter combat, looked dreadfully medieval, also properly in the concreteness of this. Also, we're talking about epic pages in military history. The Turks, by the way, countered with sticky incendiary bombs thrown by janissaries, some specialized platoons akin to some sort of grenadiers that would have evolved later. Again, the Turks were quite good with everything explosive artillery. They still dominated since the time of the granulation of powder, gun, let's say, firearms technology. And even though Europeans had surpassed them on some grounds also here, they were quite inventive and quite dynamic, right? Quite sort of hit and run, again, demonstrating that after all here, not just because of strategic ratios, the fact at least that the Maltese were defending so harshly, but that on top of that, the Westerners were, as we've seen, qualitatively superior. Besides, to mitigate these Turkish counter fires, the Knights maintained large water tubs by literally throwing themselves into them. These tubs were placed behind the ramparts and so allowing anyone hit by such a bomb to douse by themselves quickly. Because at least there was still a lot of padding, a lot of this sticky bomb was with petroleum, pitch, all this kind of stuff, and so you would get burned, but at least it would keep burning if this thing especially had arrived already to your skin underneath. And so it's really terrifying. You can imagine the horror of these engagement, what this really looked like especially when repeated, right? You would sort of get used to that, but as von Clausewitz says, you get used to that to survive in the moment, but it's not like quite that doesn't leave scars and doesn't actually in-depth yourself towards this terrifying situation. And it's about those who really stand to the last, right? More than their opponent. In any case, the use of the aforementioned defenses not only showcased the Knights' tactical ingenuity, but also compensated for their ability to repel, as we've seen, numerical inferiority through a combination of technological and psychological warfare. And definitely their spiritual background was essentially what allowed them to do so, and contributing so overwhelmingly to their clamorous success. Again, we will see, we've never made a video about Malta, and again, we're gradually entering things like Candia, in fact, the same Malta, partially today, even though through transverse ways, so to say. These were really tough, situations, circumstances, and you really want to appreciate how we pass through this as a civilization. I mean, the fact that Malta is not merely, some story that you have to tell about other people. It's really something bigger that reflects what Catholic Europe was at the time, what kind of resistance was able to put up, what kind of quality, morally and beyond, existed behind all this. So talking about the monastic military orders in the Renaissance, of course, shouldn't be anything strange. We know what this whole thing is about, and we are not surprised on Schwerpunkt. But getting a bit more into the depths of it, understanding more clearly how and why these clashes were so relevant for all of us, and what kind of, especially, what kind of meaning stands behind the same resistance, and why, for example, these orders exist today, not just as some sort of strange consequence of of history, or some relic of something really not understandable anymore, but something that really has a connection with a past that shouldn't be considered, in fact, even that distant at the end of the day in a moral fashion, right? That I think is quite relevant, and especially telling of the possibility to regain this knowledge, to regain this identity, not merely thinking of this as some kind of antiquity, but something really concrete and worth to reenact at some level, right? So this was today's video. Again, sometimes on Schwerpunkt I make so many different types of videos that everything sounds relatively experimental, right? And it's as if, at some levels it would seem like unsatisfactory. Everything is unsatisfactory, of course. Making these long videos is not easy. You probably get a slightly more polished version of the way that initially record them, but it's pretty impactful to study this stuff. It's not merely, again, describing the principle by words, but showing how this is literally declined in the very evidence, right? That's the part that I care about very much, blending the military aspect with the evidence of the driving factor itself. I think that's quite crucial, really. Very well. However, this for today was it for really today. In fact, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.